Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something really cool. We are going to demystify the hidden mechanics of wealth accumulation and economic inequality. Basically, we're pulling back the curtain on how wealth is actually built versus how we kind of think it's built, and we'll look at the powerful economic forces that really determine who gets ahead and who gets left behind. Whether you're a seasoned economics nerd or just someone trying to figure out why your paycheck never seems to go far enough, I promise you, this explainer is going to completely change how you view money.
So picture this. On one side, we have a doctor making a massive $250,000 a year, but they spend absolutely every penny on a huge mortgage, luxury cars, private clubs, the whole shebang. Now, on the right side, compare that to a neighborhood plumber making $90,000 a year who quietly and consistently saves and invests 20% of that income. Flash forward a couple of decades, and who's wealthier? It's the plumber. And honestly, it's by a landslide. This highlights a really critical but super often misunderstood difference. Your income paycheck is not the same thing as actual wealth.
Okay, let's dive into this a bit deeper. Researchers Thomas Stanley and William Danko actually spent 20 years studying real millionaires, and they categorized these two exact financial paths perfectly. They define folks like our high-earning, high-spending doctor as under-accumulators of wealth, or UAWs. These are people who focus entirely on just consuming their income. On the flip side, we have the prodigious accumulators of wealth, or PAWs. These are often your totally average earners who aggressively save and invest. It's a fascinating paradox, right? It shows us two very distinct paths, relying purely on wages to survive versus building up accumulated assets.
Which brings us right into Section 1, Unpacking the Wealth Formula, How Capital Outpaces Labor.
Now, what happens when we zoom out from our relatable neighborhood examples and look at the entire global economy? To really understand the macroeconomic forces at play here, we've got to talk about French economist Thomas Piketty. Back in 2013, his book, Capital in the 21st Century, basically shook the economic world with a super simple formula. R is greater than G. Here's what that actually means in plain English. The R stands for the rate of return on capital. So think of this as profits from investments, real estate, corporate stocks, things like that. The G stands for the rate of overall economic growth, which is what drives standard wages and your everyday labor income. Piketty argues that historically, returns on existing investments, the R, consistently grow faster than the annual raises at a normal 9-to-5 job, the G.
And check out these numbers, because this brilliantly illustrates exactly why that matters. Say your labor wages, your G, are growing at a pretty standard 2% annual raise. But your boss's investment portfolio, their R, is compounding at a 5% return. The math here is incredibly unforgiving. Over a 20-year period, that 5% return on existing wealth rapidly and aggressively outpaces a 2% wage increase. Because of the magic of compounding, wealth just naturally concentrates at the top. The owners of capital simply leave the wage earners completely in the dust. In fact, Piketty warns that if this R greater than G dynamic runs unchecked for decades, a society risks sliding back into what he calls patrimonial capitalism. It sounds a bit academic, but it really just means a system dominated by inherited wealth, where the advantages of the past entirely dictate the future. Think about it. If the wealth you inherit grows faster than any new wealth someone else can create through sheer hard work, we risk moving right back toward a rigid class structure, like an oligarchy, where existing wealth matters way more than new labor or innovation.
That naturally leads us into Section 2, the Great Gatsby Curve, the collapse of social mobility.
Because if wealth naturally concentrates at the top, we really have to ask, what happens to social mobility? What happens to the whole American dream of working your way up from the bottom when economic outcomes become this unequal? Let's map out this problem using what's called the Great Gatsby Curve. On the horizontal axis down here, we're measuring income inequality. So further to the right means a more unequal society. On the vertical axis, we have intergenerational persistence of income. That's really just a fancy way of asking, how likely are you to be stuck in the exact same economic class as your parents? Higher up on the axis means less mobility. Just look at that strong upward trend. It shows that countries with higher inequality naturally have much lower upward social mobility.
And the real-world consequence of this curve is honestly staggering. According to the OECD, in societies with the highest inequality and the lowest mobility, it can take up to 7 generations, literally 7 generations, for a low-income family just to reach that country's average income level. Just let that sink in for a second. The advantages and disadvantages of parents are firmly passed down, making it systemically harder for everyday wage earners to cross over into that capital-owning class.
All right, let's bring it back down to earth in Section 3, the millionaire next door, escaping the cycle through micro behaviors.
So the macroeconomic system is heavily weighted toward existing capital, right? But how do ordinary people, like our plumber from the very beginning of the explainer, actually manage to build capital and beat these systemic hurdles? Well, this is where the behaviors of the prodigious accumulator of wealth come into play. According to the research, everyday millionaires are incredibly disciplined. They live well below their means, they definitely aren't driving Ferraris. Actually, the most common vehicle among them is a used Ford F-150. They wear off-the-rack clothing, they avoid luxury status objects like the plague, and fascinatingly, they often work in super boring industries like pest control, paving, or commercial cleaning, where absolutely no one suspects high wealth. They prioritize deep financial independence over the superficial display of high social status.
There's a great old Texas phrase for people who fake their wealth. Big hat, no cattle. I absolutely love that. The crucial point here is that trying to look better off by buying a Porsche on credit or taking on a massive house you can barely afford actively prevents you from accumulating the actual capital needed to build true wealth. You are quite literally spending tomorrow's cash today. Every single dollar you spend signaling status to other people is a dollar that cannot go into your investment returns. Okay, let's pivot to Section 4, Proposed Fixes and Criticisms, the debate over capitalism's future.
So we've seen how individuals can navigate wealth building. But what about fixing the wider systemic inequality? Let's take an impartial look at the macro solutions being proposed and the heavy criticisms those ideas face from other leading economists. To combat that R greater than G dynamic, Thomas Piketty proposed massive state intervention. He suggested a progressive annual global wealth tax of up to 2%, paired with a progressive income tax that could reach as high as 80% on top earners. The whole idea is to forcefully redistribute wealth to prevent an oligarchy from forming. However, it is definitely worth noting that even Piketty himself admits that trying to coordinate a global wealth tax across different countries would be politically, well, nearly impossible.
And on top of that, Piketty's theories are heavily debated. For instance, former U.S. Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers points out a pretty major flaw in Piketty's math. Summers argues that as capital accumulates, its return actually drops. He notes that Piketty largely ignores asset depreciation. Think about it. Modern capital, like software or laptops, depreciates in value way faster than a massive steel mill did a century ago. Therefore, the net return to capital is actually much lower than Piketty assumes, meaning capital returns will naturally decline over time anyway.
And other top economists push back too. Harvard's Greg Mankiw argues that the Great Gatsby curve is really just an artifact of diversity. Basically, he says that comparing highly diverse populations like the US to very homogeneous ones like Denmark naturally skews the data. An IMF economist, Carlos Ghosn, actually tested Piketty's formula and found zero empirical support for it. He noted that in 75% of the countries he studied, the exact opposite trend occurred. And Matthew Rogley reinforced that Piketty's reliance on gross returns rather than net returns fundamentally flaws his conclusion. So while Piketty's work is an incredibly fascinating and powerful lens, it is certainly not a universally accepted economic law. Which brings us to the ultimate crossroads today. We've explored the massive, systemic macroeconomic forces that seem to guarantee wealth stays firmly at the top. But we've also explored the quiet, disciplined habits of the everyday millionaire next door who manages to build a fortune regardless of the system. So I want to leave you with this question to really reflect on. Is wealth inequality driven more by the systemic design of capitalism, or is it driven more by our personal behaviors, financial literacy, and our daily habits? It's a huge question. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.